I have to be honest. When I was in seminary, Matthew was my least favorite gospel. I don't usually like to hear about being thrown into outer darkness, and weeping and gnashing of teeth is about as far as you can get from the God of love that I believe in. I wish I could wave away the concerns I have with this morning's text. We don't really have time to explore its problems in detail. I think it's important to note, though, that about 10 years before the Gospel of Matthew was written, Rome destroyed the temple in Jerusalem and burned down the city. There's a connection to that violence and the violence in our text. Our text even mentions burning a city. Matthew is writing to a broken and hurting community, harmed by imperial violence. Matthew uses the language of his time to describe his anger at the devastation in his community. That may not excuse the language of this text, and I wish we had more time to explore that. But if we can put the violence in a shoebox for a moment and look at the text with that lens, perhaps we can find some liberating and life-giving hope. The king in this gospel is generous. The grace he bestows upon the newly invited guests sets up a paradigm of gratitude. Generosity, grace, and gratitude. Those are the themes underlying this text. First, the king invites guests to a lavish feast. This king wants to sustain human life. Contrast that to empire. Imagine Roman occupation, where harsh taxes are designed solely for the purposes of draining human life in order to feed and support the emperor. This text is inviting Matthew's audience to imagine a different sort of kingdom, where the king is generous, cares so much for those around him that he gives generously and wants them to have enough. Instead of the poor providing resources for the emperor, in this kingdom, the king provides for the poor. This king is generous. Second, there is grace. This wedding feast is not for those who are worthy. The wedding invitations, in the end, go out to all. In fact, I wonder if you have ever gotten an invitation to an event and thought, I'm not sure if I'm going to like the people who are going to be there, so I may not go. Well, that is this wedding invitation. This invitation is so big that it frustrates us. It includes the people we do not want to be invited, the good and the bad, the smart and the not so smart, the pretty and the not so pretty, the Democrats and the Republicans, those who will vote for Biden and those who will vote for Trump. All. Can you imagine the looks of all of us when we see the seating cards at that table? Who will we sit next to? It might be frustrating, but that is grace. You are invited to this festive banquet where a generous God wants to provide for all human flourishing. And so is everyone else. You didn't earn a seat at this generous table, and neither did anyone else. That is grace. And finally, there's gratitude. Most guests realized the magnitude of the gift they were being given. They responded accordingly in our parable, and they dressed for the occasion. But one guest didn't seem to care. He didn't dress for the wedding. Was he indifferent to the invitation? Was he entitled, feeling that he didn't need to dress up because he should have been there anyway? The man doesn't give an answer as to why he was not dressed well, but I don't think any of us read this text and want to be in his position. Gratitude is more than a feeling. It's a response to the generosity of God that is given to us with grace and not because of our merit. We're invited to a festive banquet out of grace. We respond. We get dressed up. Gratitude, grace, generosity, they are big words. They are overused words, and sometimes when I use them, I'll hear people say they don't really mean anything. I think they do mean something. I think these three words are the foundation of our faith. Gratitude, grace, generosity, do they matter? In the last 6 months, we have endured a period where disease has shut down the land, when the empire seems to focus more on its leader than on caring for its people. Do you remember what it was like back in March? Toilet paper could not be found. I remember walking into the grocery store and being perplexed, even scared, because food was gone from the shelves. I remember thinking, how are we going to eat? But we have a generous God. And this community knows about gratitude, grace, and generosity. And we are rising together with God's help. In that period of scarcity, St. Paul's flew into action in that fearful time, and you made over 500 masks sewn in your own homes to be distributed among our neighbors, both within our congregation and sent to community service organizations. You set up a ministry, Cathedral Connections, to make sure that people had enough to eat. You gave of your time with circles of love to make sure people were not isolated. You lived into the vision of the generous King and lived generously yourself in a time of deep scarcity. This past year, we also lived through a nation that had clamped down its borders, where systemic racism had allowed the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and so many others, where divisions in the country have led to assassination attempts and riots and tear gas against peaceful protesters. But we have a God of grace. And this community knows about gratitude, grace, and generosity. And we are rising together with God's help. St. Paul's listened. This community knew from its history of living into God's open and unabashed grace that the first step is listening. And over 100 people turned out for an extended study in the forum on the book Waking Up White, so that we could start looking at white privilege. And that's led us into a 10-month-long journey into sacred ground as we do the hard and extensive work of uncovering our own racial biases and participation in systemic racism ourselves, in the church we love, and in the nation we care for so deeply. We are striving to mirror God's grace for all people, which also requires justice and peace. And finally, this past year has been a year of entitlement. We've seen a refusal to wear masks, an almost systemic problem in our nation of believing that everybody should be able to do whatever they want without limits. A putting of self at the center without regard to how frontline workers are affected by exposure to COVID and other challenges of life. But we have a God who values gratitude. St. Paul's attendance at worship has increased in this turbulent time. Even with our buildings closed, we have new expressions of worship, whether it's online morning prayer or prayer outside in the park, where we express our gratitude and give thanks for what we've been given. We don't take it for granted. In the conversations at many of these gatherings, I've heard about your practices of gratitude that reflect that St. Paul's understands that the gifts we are given must not be taken for granted, whether those gifts are people or jobs or food or time itself or money. I know that some of you have wounds from abusive churches related to money. And the pledge campaign, which we begin today, can reopen some of those wounds. Churches or clergy that demand money from parishioners, or that tell people how much they should be paying to the church, or that threaten expulsion from God's love if they don't pay, well, that's just religious abuse. It's not what this season is about. At St. Paul's, there is no such demand. Generosity is meant to be liberating. Giving itself is generative, and it creates life. It fosters gratitude. Pledge season is not about guilt or judgment. It's an opportunity to reflect on how God has generously provided liberating and life-giving grace in your own life, and how you decide to respond in gratitude. This year and any year, if you have lost your job, please do not pledge if it would put your essential needs at risk. Please do not pledge an amount that will cause you to suffer. That is not what God wants for you. I do encourage you to pray about your pledge as a spiritual practice. We have a generous God. Where have you seen that in your life? Where can you look in your life and find that you have received God's grace? And how will the expression of gratitude for that generosity and grace be reflected in your pledge as you look forward to next year? God has given you everything you have. How do you mark your journey of gratitude financially with action, in giving back to God from what God has given you? Is it in working towards a tithe, or increasing a percentage each year, or some other measure? I encourage you to make a practice every year of marking your journey in some way and figuring out how to deepen it in whatever makes sense for you. St. Paul's is a place of generosity and grace and gratitude. God is present in this place. Thanks be to God for you and for us and for all the ministry and community that continues to make St. Paul's what it is. We are rising together.